Hello, my name is Randy Rutta, President and CEO of AARDA, the American Autoimmune Related Diseases Association. And I am pleased for this conversation, our Insights conversation with thought leaders. I'll be talking today with Dr. Nandi and Lilly Stairs, two excellent experts on the topic of the challenges facing people with gastroenterological issues around COVID-19, as well as the challenge of just barriers that exist for patients and their physicians in accessing the medicines and care that they need. Dr. Nandi is the Associate Professor of Clinical Medicine at Penn Presbyterian Medical Center at the University of Pennsylvania, and Lilly Stairs is a board member for AARDA, an official on the AARDA board, who also is the founder and president of Patient Authentic LLC, which is a patient advocacy organization who really reinforces the voice of the patients for so many communities, individuals, and organizations across the country. She has also served in a capacity to engage patients in clinical research and other resources for Clara Health, as well as the Savvy Corporation. Strong credentials in understanding the needs of patients, the experience of patients, and the ways in which we can support them in the challenges that they're facing. So let me start first with you, Dr. Nandi. Tell us a little bit about your practice, the types of patients that you see, the disorders that you treat, and really what's the average time for diagnosis, which I know for many people with autoimmune conditions can be pretty extended.
Absolutely. Randall and AARDA, thank you so much for having me. I'm very blessed to be here, and I'm excited to kind of talk about some of the subject matter we're going to cover here with you and Lilly. As you mentioned, I'm an IBDologist. I'm a Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis specialist. And so for those tuning in, this is illnesses of the immune system attacking the gut. And so this results in ulcerations of the intestine. There are two big types of umbrellas within inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. Usually ulcerative colitis patients, you ask, how long does it take to get diagnosed? Averages are about 1 to 6 months because the symptoms are quite alarming, bloody diarrhea being the hallmark. And so certainly anybody seeing that in their stool chronically is going to seek consultation, and we'll get a colonoscopy and get diagnosed. Crohn's disease patients, though, it can be a bit longer, anywhere from 1 to 1.5 years. And that's just here at a minimum. That's just here in the West. But I've had patients who have had symptoms for years longer, 4, 6, 10 years before they were diagnosed, because the symptoms are not so obvious. It can be abdominal pain, bloat, random bouts of nausea, sometimes diarrhea. Lack of diarrhea doesn't mean you don't have Crohn's. And because the symptoms are vague, they often get passed off as irritable bowel syndrome. My patients are at increased risk to get C. difficile, and that's why I do fecal microbiota transplantations, or FMTs. Now we're calling them IMT, intestinal microbiota transplantation, where we take healthy stool and implant that back inside the colon to go ahead and get rid of the C. diff by giving it good gut flora. So those are a little bit of the interests that I have.
That's great. And I'm interested in building on that a little bit. What are the latest trends that you're seeing in treating gastroenterological diseases? I mean, what do you think sounds most promising at this point in time?
Well, this is one of the most exciting times, actually, to be in the field of IBD as a physician. And it's also one of the most hopeful times because as a patient, I would think, and I would like to know, Lilly's perspective on these things too. The evolution of treatment, that paradigm has evolved so much over the last 5 years. It wasn't until the late 90s that all we were treating was steroids and surgery. And then came the advent of infliximab, which is commercially known as Remicade, and then several of its cousins, which kind of dominated the treatment sphere up until at least 2015, when we came out with additional biologic therapies such as vedolizumab, commercially known as Entyvio, and then in 2016 with another different agent that's anti-IL-12/23, fancy talk for antibody to a cytokine hormone in the body called ustekinumab, and that's commercially known as Stelara. So just in the last 5 years, we've seen 2 different additional types of strategies to treat Crohn's. That means there's 3 different ways. But I want to step back. Why is it exciting? Because 3 therapies is not even close to being enough. what we label as Crohn's, what we label as ulcerative colitis, there's more than one way the body's systems malfunction to cause the illness. And for every way, every cause, there's a different treatment. So we have 3 treatments that help many patients, but not all. So our work is far from done. So it's exciting because the last 2 biologic therapies in the last 5 years are now going to herald the evolutionary development of active clinical trials. We're going to see an explosion of therapeutics in the next 5 to 7 years. We're going to see more and more drugs come to market. But these drugs are looking at not just fancy biologic antibodies that we engineer in the lab. Those antibodies block a hormone or cytokine in the body that creates the Crohn's or colitis. But also, we're going to start seeing more therapies in about 10 years, possibly earlier, I would love, that are looking at the role of the gut flora. How do we manipulate the microbiota? And that just means not only bacteria, but the yeast, the viruses that are in there. How do we reestablish, influence the gut microbiota, influence disease? And then also, can we utilize nutrition more intelligently? Can we have really nice diagnostic tests that help us manipulate nutrition to influence gut flora and to influence the immune system? That's just the tip of the iceberg right there.
Well, I can certainly see why you're excited, because that is very promising. It really reflects a lot of breakthroughs and learning, I feel, as well as a holistic approach for helping patients really understand and manage their conditions. What is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic been, though, on people literally being able to manage their gastroenterological conditions, but then also access their care and just simply, prevent themselves from being at greater risk of contracting the disease or experiencing serious illness from it?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. Right now, the pandemic that we have lived in, I don't think anybody could have ever thought that 2020 would be scathed, and life had been changed so profoundly. And certainly our community that's tuning in now, not just the IBD patients that I get to take care of, but our entire autoimmune community who has a chronic illness, especially those who are additional on immunosuppression, were scared, right? They lived in fear. Do I go out to the grocery store? Do I go to work? How do I make money? I mean, there's a million questions that they had to ask themselves. And we've come a long way. Right now, it's June 2020. And so we are, 3-4 months into this. My patients, their care was initially affected because, and like many others, that in-person clinic visits were temporarily canceled in the very early phase, causing delay. And then telemedicine visits were scheduled in a very rapid pace in my healthcare system at UPenn, who ramped up the technology quickly. But then there were other barriers, technological barriers, adoption of the technology, many barriers. But now that we've been up and running, some of those delays we're trying to catch up. We're playing catch up. So patients could not attend their clinic visits, so telemedicine took that place. We don't have telescopes, haha. But really life-saving, procedures like dilations. We had to pick and choose, which patients were the sickest of the sick to come in, which was heart-wrenching. But even then, patients who we really wanted to come in, felt fear, and I can't blame them. They delayed their care, even though they knew they needed that procedure. So that's a horrible situation to be put in. Horrible situation. And then lastly, infusion therapies and imaging and labs, right? These are healthcare facilities that sometimes you go get your infusion at a center or that comes to you, home infusion. Sometimes you go to a lab or mobile draw, they come to you. That's not very common. But there was the concern by patients that would their hardworking healthcare professionals, their nurses, their phlebotomists, their radiology technicians potentially be transmitting infections, right, to them or carrying them. And this stress wasn't really just on the patients alone. It was also on the healthcare providers who wanted to protect themselves, their own family, and their patients that they've dedicated their careers to. So it's been a very complex interplay. What I can say is, with great pride, is that patients have never been more understanding of the challenges of medicine. My IBD patients, I can speak for and vouch for, they have been angels and have been very accommodating, and I thank them for that. At the same time, the healthcare system has really rallied. And, everyone's been left to their own devices to meet these challenges. And the healthcare system has rallied to deliver effective telemedicine, to block time, to give training. Social distancing measures within the hospitals, right, have been in place to maximize safety, so that patients can get procedures, lab draws, imaging, colonoscopy. So I've just been astonished with how rapid we have, adjusted, because we had to adjust so that we could still deliver patient care. But there's no doubt there's been a delay.
Well, Dr. Nandi, it's really encouraging to hear you say that. It's pretty remarkable in terms of rallying the way the entire community did, physicians and patients, the resilience that people have shown in getting through this very difficult time, but then also the realities about how we go forward, addressing not just this new challenge of COVID that's going to be with us for a while, but then also the barriers and challenges that have always existed, I think, for people with autoimmune disease, including people with IBD. Well, why don't I turn to you, Lilly, because as a patient advocate, be very interested to know what challenges you've personally faced, what you've seen your colleagues in the patient community face. You've worked tirelessly to raise awareness about autoimmune disease, but yet we hear about these access barriers that often put patients' health at risk, that defer or delay access to prescribed medicines that their physicians know would be best for them. How are those restrictions that we've seen in our system affect you personally and the people that you've had an opportunity to know as a patient advocate and leader in this space?
Yeah, thanks, Randy, and thanks for bringing me on today. It's always a pleasure to chat with you and Dr. Nandi, who is just one of the best IBD-ologists out there, really passionate, cares deeply for his patients, and really breaks everything down nicely. You broke down a lot of concepts very quickly that I think are really beneficial for patients. So thank you for that. As we look at access, it is a huge issue for autoimmune patients. And something that comes to mind for me when I think about this is that autoimmune patients, we are forced to live in the unknown all the time. We live in the unknown until we get diagnosed. It takes often years, as Dr. Nandi mentioned, for autoimmune and IBD patients to get diagnosed. So you're living in this unknown. What's happening to me? And then you finally get diagnosed, and there's still a lot of unknowns. Well, everybody's different. So, we have to try different treatment methods, and some of these work for some people, sometimes they don't work for others. And so, and then, finally, when you get your disease under control, if you are able to get it under control, you live in fear that that medicine might stop working or you might develop antibodies. And so the life of an autoimmune patient is one of living in the unknown, and access fits right into that bucket. We live in the unknown when it comes to access. And so for me personally as a patient, I will tell you that when I think about the step therapy, again, this is that concept of physicians prescribing a medicine that they would like for their patient to be on, but insurers denying that medication and making patients first try other medications first. This is an incredibly dangerous practice. It's something that I live in fear right now. I'm on a medicine, I'm well controlled. I've been in medically controlled remission from my IBD and my psoriatic arthritis and my psoriasis for 6.5 years because of the medication that I am on. I live in fear that if I switch insurers or my insurance company changes their formulary, am I going to have to go back? Am I going to be forced to try these other medications? And when that happens, if that were to ever happen, these autoimmune diseases, they move quick. They take no prisoners. You can have real, so for example, when I think back to when I was first diagnosed, I literally woke up one morning and I couldn't move. My whole body was paralyzed with pain. And this was not gradual. This was just one morning I woke up and I couldn't move. And then that was my psoriatic arthritis diagnosis. Then I look at my Crohn's diagnosis. It was literally one afternoon that I just had this unbelievable stomach pain out of nowhere. They move fast. You need to treat them fast and you need to treat them aggressively. And so if your doctor wants you on a specific medication, you need to go on that medication immediately. If you are forced to try these other medications first, what happens is that you can end up with irreversible damage. And you, from joint damage, lifelong joint damage, to needing a surgery. In many IBD patients' cases, they end up having to have surgery because their intestines get to such an inflamed point that there's damage beyond repair. So, I mean, this is when we think about access. These are very real challenges that patients are facing, and we are trying to pass these step therapy laws in many states, but we are still not there yet. And so there are a lot of patients who are struggling to get access to the medications that they need.
No, Lily, that's so true. And I really appreciate you sharing what's a very personal perspective, but also just a fear, every day a fear that something may change that would upset your access to what you know is the best remedy for you. And then if your body's needs start to change, is the system going to respond to that and allow you to then go to that next best medicine that's going to be best for you at that time? So thank you for characterizing that. And I know you speak for a lot of IBD patients, a lot of autoimmune patients who live in that fear and have been experiencing that disruption because of prior authorizations, step therapy, formulary limitations, fail first policies, which can really set them back and is so frightening. And that in itself creates a stress that then can lead to more disease, flare-ups and concerns. It just really is reinforcing exactly the wrong things, and I would argue pretty in an unwarranted and unnecessary way. I'm wondering, Dr. Nandi, does that speak to your experience with your patients? Have you, trying to have this excellent relationship that you have with doctors and patients and, the system that you're working in, have you experienced in your own practice some of the very barriers that Lily just described and their consequences?
Absolutely. And I think Lily very poignantly described the sense of fear it inspires, unfortunately for our patients. And I wish insurers who are very frustrating to work with exception, would rise to the challenge. We must, do what is just, right? What is right. And that has not been my experience with most insurance phone calls. And I'll tell you to substantiate that harsh criticism. Insurance companies look at numbers. They look at a fiscal year. The majority of them are businesses. The majority are for profit. And we're talking about lives, quality of life here. But at the end of the day, we do have to be fiscally responsible. Healthcare economics means something. But the reality is that a lot of these revolutionary agents, which can keep wonderful patients like Lily in remission and in better health so she can contribute and continue the wonderful advocacy she does, when they don't look at the 3-year, 5-year, 10-year savings to the healthcare system or quality of life. Because on a fiscal year, they know that the insurance, the patient's insurance may change once a year, sometimes 2 or 3 times a year. So they're looking at a very short snapshot in time. Whereas a lot of our data suggests that when we keep our wonderful patients in remission, not just for a year, 2, 3, 5, on indefinitely when it works that well, that there is a healthcare savings to the system. So there's a problem here fiscally and the outlook of the insurance company. They're looking at 1 year, and that's what they're buying on wholesale and doing, backroom rebates with pharma to get the best deal. But they may not be looking at what's best at the individual patient level. So that brings us to the next problem, which is physicians like myself. Every day we do peer-to-peers. We often get denials. We don't stop there. We pick up the phone, make a peer-to-peer. I'll be honest, my wonderful support staff helps me make a lot of those phone calls. I couldn't do it without them, and they deserve a lot of thanks. And then we get to the medical director, who oftentimes is not an individual who can actually overturn a denial. That's the usual case. They will simply explain the policy, which gets you nowhere. Then you file another appeal, and that may get you usually a non-GI specialist to speak with, someone who is in a completely different specialty. It might be general medicine, it might be family medicine, it might be, I've had a nephrologist try to talk to me about biologics before, but somebody who is unqualified. Now, insurance companies do not provide the latest and greatest CME or education about biologics to these physicians. I'm sure they're good physicians, but they need the knowledge if they're going to make a decision on a patient. Sometimes you can get a specialty peer-to-peer but this is usually a third-party hire vendored out by the insurance company, who is a gastroenterologist, but not necessarily an IBD specialist. And ultimately, at the end of the day, now I've had some great exceptions to the rule with a medical director who cared to listen to the story, but many times we're met with, this is what the policy shows. This is, they must fail this. Well, they already failed drug X. Why are you going to put them on drug X? I'm telling you, I've trained for 15 years to tell you that this is not going to help. But these are the problems. So how do we solve this issue? How do we begin to even create or affect change? Both Lilly and I have been involved with the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. We're involved with AARDA, who is a powerful advocate for our patients. And many nonprofit medical chronic illness organizations try to lobby on Capitol Hill. And it's important that we not only just have clinicians like myself and powerful patient advocates like Lilly, but patients, family members, spouses, caregivers, children, write to their senators, write to their House of Representatives. There are two acts that are very relevant here. One is the Safe Step Act, which is HR 2279. I always get the numbers, so I wrote them down. And something related to this is nutrition. Nutrition supplements, protein shakes is just the tip of the iceberg, are not just nutrition, which is important. Sometimes they're therapy. Sometimes they're your life-saving goal. Nutrition makes bacteria grow, creates a strong integrity of the gut. And so there's the Medical Nutrition Equity Act, which is HR 2501. So those are things that we've been able to lobby on Capitol Hill for. Last year was my first time getting to do that. And then this year we do it annually. But if you're tuning in and listening to this broadcast, that's a way that you out there at home can look up these acts, the Safe Step Act and the Medical Nutrition Equity Act, and appeal to your state representatives if they are giving their support for these bills, because that's one way. Now, the Safe Step Act holds insurances a little more accountable, that they have to give a little bit more justification or reasoning, rationale to the rejection, and empowers the clinician to go ahead and appeal on more logical grounds. It's not perfect, but it's a step in the right direction.
Well, Dr. Nandi, I think you really characterized so well, that the problem that exists, but also then what are the avenues to drive change? And they're on the policy side, they're in the interactions with the different systems players as you interact with insurance companies. I would hope employers that are oftentimes funding insurance for their employees would be a little more sensitive, maybe put systems in place that are a little smarter relative to the investment they make in their patients with IBD or autoimmune disease, so that looking long term, that individual can be an effective employee, productive and engaged and retained over time in a way that I think all employers want, and that would be an additional constituency. AARDA, has a coalition movement called Let My Doctors Decide that we do in collaboration with gastroenterologists, with rheumatologists, with patients and nurses and the office staff that you mentioned that are so often involved in this, to bring home and drive change in exactly the way you described. Lilly, you've been an active part of Let My Doctors Decide and really shaping the way AARDA has played in exactly those places that Dr. Nandi just described. What's your perspective on how we can marshal our resources collectively to affect change that really benefit individual patients and then the system overall?
Yeah, so I'm going to echo what Dr. Nandi shared, that this is all about your story. If you have a story to tell, if you are a patient or caregiver and you have experienced this, or you live in fear of experiencing this, share it. And if you're not sure how to navigate the policy, talk to us at AARDA. We have Let My Doctors Decide. We have templates that make it really easy for you to plug in your story and send it to your representative. We want to be able to elevate your story too. So if you want to work through us, we're happy to make that happen. That is how we will affect change, because there's something that, as I have a bit of a marketing background, and there's something that we as marketers say, which is that facts tell, stories sell. And if we want to change policy, we need to share our stories. And so that's the heart of all of this. And so that would be what I encourage folks to do.
Well, that's just great. And I know that you've been extremely effective, in your current role as founder and principal for Patient Authentic, and the work that you've done as a patient advocate in other settings where you've really helped patients engage and tell their story for their own benefit, for their own health, as well as for change within the system has been enormously effective. And I think that's exactly the message you bring forward, which I appreciate. Any final words from you, Lilly, or from Dr. Nandi in terms of building on that call to action or seeing us through COVID-19 to really make sure that these barriers, which are so unnecessary, can be put aside, and so that the patient and the patient first, their health and wellness is best understood by their physician, really becomes the driver in how systems think about being supportive. Any last thoughts?
I have some thoughts in regards to this pandemic. We have probably always recognized that the online sphere is replete with misconception and misinformation, and it's just been more amplified in the world of COVID. There's a lot of people trying to take advantage of patients, especially those with chronic illnesses, and it infuriates me. I want you to, if you're listening to this as a patient, as a caregiver, family member, or friend, to be conscious of this. There's a lot of mistrust of Western medicine that has developed historically for understandable reasons, but now more than ever, communicating with your doctor, your nurse, your physician assistant, your dietitian, your nutritionist, it's never been more important to get trusted information. AARDA, the website is Trusted Resources, Trusted Information. Lilly's, a little mantra there. I can't say it as eloquently as she did, but stories sell. Stories illustrate the truth. Your story hasn't been heard. Everybody's story is unique. It's the power of voices. And the campaign that AARDA is leading in terms of advocacy is very critical to this because it ties again all chronic disease states together. So your story is important. Don't think for a second that we don't need to hear from you. We do. And then we can help direct your voice to the politicians and powers, insurers, employers that need to hear it. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm inspired by your words, and know that AARDA, our partners and colleagues through Let My Doctors Decide and patient advocates, shoulder to shoulder with you and other physicians that care so much, are going to do exactly that. Be present, share resources, and be spokespersons. Lilly, just ask you for your last thoughts. I know Dr. Nandi mentioned telemedicine. That's a way to get beyond perhaps that social distancing of COVID, which for many people with a compromised immune system really is the smart way to go. But how do we do it? You were just suggesting, Dr. Nandi, from your perspective, Lilly, in terms of staying connected, understanding each other, being a voice, whether it's through telemedicine or other channels. I'd be interested in your final thoughts on that.
Yeah, telemedicine is really, it's so exciting that we're starting to see this really become something that is more regularly used by patients and physicians. And I recognize it's been a bit of a forcing function because of COVID-19. I like to think of it as a silver lining of COVID-19, and that we are seeing this because telemedicine is really an incredible way and more accessible way for patients from across all different backgrounds to be able to connect with their physician. I say that with some caveats because I certainly think that we have a lot more work to do there to make telemedicine more accessible, keeping in mind that not everybody has access to a computer or video chat. So how do we make sure that phone calls are reimbursable? But I think that we could have a whole nother conversation about that, so I won't go too hard down that path today. But yes, it is really exciting because it's a scary time for autoimmune patients to be going into hospitals and to physicians' offices. Even outside of COVID-19, autoimmune patients don't love going into hospitals and physicians' offices because we're immunocompromised, right? A lot of these medicines that we're on are immunosuppressing, and so it's much easier for us to get sick. And so what telemedicine does is it eases that burden a bit. It takes away having to travel, and it allows us to connect with our physician and make sure that we're having these regular check-ins. And so I encourage you, if you are not already doing telemedicine with your physician, to try it out, to talk to your physician's office to see if it is an option. For some of your care, it won't be able to replace everything, but it will be able to reduce some of that burden, which is really great. So, those are my thoughts on the telemedicine piece. And I think that's a great way to stay connected during this pandemic. And then, from the access side, I know you sort of wanted my final words there too. And again, I think it's just really important that you speak up, because it's not going to be a couple of voices that moves the needle on this. It has to be a lot of us. And so your story, your voice is really important, and not everybody feels comfortable speaking publicly. And sharing your story doesn't mean having to go testify before Congress. Sharing your story can be in a letter, it can be on the phone. And so it can be in a more private way. And so again, I encourage you to really consider doing that. And let's all continue supporting each other, both from an access standpoint and then from a community standpoint through this pandemic, because it's definitely a difficult time for everyone, but especially autoimmune patients.
Well, I think that's so true. And thank you for your words just throughout this conversation. Both you, Lilly, and Dr. Nandi, really appreciate everything that you're doing on behalf of the gastroenterology community, IBD patients, people with autoimmune diseases across that full spectrum of conditions, to really address these barriers, whether it's a emerged challenge in the COVID pandemic, or whether it's really those long-standing gaps that don't work in the patient and physician's best interest. I think both of you are real champions in bringing that awareness forward, an understanding of those barriers and limitations of the system, and really giving patients that individualized attention that they deserve, and the treatments that their doctors know that are going to do the best for them. And also then pointing out the channels of communication that we have with each other, with decision makers in public policy roles, in the insurance industry, employers and others who collectively have a stake in our community, the health of our community, the well-being of our community, and the contribution that all of us can make together. So thank you so much for your insights, your information, and your example today. Take care.